Something happened in January 2026 that could permanently reshape the global financial system, and almost nobody saw it coming. What makes this even more shocking is where it came from. Not Washington, not Wall Street, not even the Federal Reserve. It came from the BRICS alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now joined by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Together, they quietly activated a brand new international currency system known as the unit. And at this very moment, it is live, operational, and already being used for cross-border trade settlements. Let that sink in for a second. This is not a proposal sitting on a conference table. It's not a pilot program. It's not something planned for the distant future. The unit is functioning right now as a legitimate alternative payment system, giving these nations the ability to execute massive trade deals without relying on a single US dollar. For your entire lifetime, the US dollar has stood as the uncontested king of global commerce. Almost everything bought, sold, or traded across borders was priced in dollars and settled in dollars. It wasn't just the dominant system, it was the only system that truly mattered. If global finance were a battlefield, the dollar wasn't just winning, it had no real challengers. So what just changed? BRICS didn't try to tear down the old system. Instead, they did something far more strategic. They built a completely separate one, a parallel financial universe. Their own infrastructure, their own transaction rails, their own settlement mechanism. And then, without making dramatic headlines, they opened it for business to nearly half of the world's population. The dollar-based system isn't gone, at least not yet. But for the first time in roughly 80 years, a credible and fully operational alternative now exists, backed by some of the fastest-growing economies on Earth and populations that represent a massive share of global demand. The age of the dollar facing zero competition may have just come to an end. The monopoly is no longer untouchable. Naturally, this raises an important question. How does the unit actually work? And what makes it different from simply trading in existing national currencies? The answer lies in its design, a strategy that is surprisingly simple, yet extremely calculated. The entire framework rests on two powerful foundations, both carefully chosen to address the biggest fears countries have when adopting any new currency: stability and sovereignty. The first foundation is gold backing. Approximately 40% of the unit's value is directly pegged to physical gold stored in highly secured vaults across BRICS nations. Not paper gold, not digital representations, not ETFs. We're talking about real, tangible metal, the kind that can be independently audited and verified. The message behind this move is unmistakable. This currency is anchored to something real, something that has preserved wealth for over 5,000 years, something trusted across cultures, borders, and political systems. Gold doesn't need a government's promise to hold value. History has already done that. By tying the unit to gold, BRICS is signaling credibility, discipline, and long-term confidence. But the remaining 60% is where the strategy becomes even more sophisticated. That portion is backed by a carefully weighted basket of BRICS national currencies. Instead of depending on the economic strength of a single country, the unit draws support from multiple major economies at once. This approach spreads risk, reduces vulnerability to any one nation's financial shocks, and creates a structure designed for resilience. In other words, it isn't just a currency, it's a reflection of collective economic power. The currencies forming this basket include the Chinese yuan, the Indian rupee, the Russian ruble, the Brazilian real, and the South African rand. Together, they represent a massive wager on the future of the global economy. The message behind this structure is clear. Our combined economic strength, our vast natural resources, our manufacturing dominance, our rapidly expanding consumer markets, and a collective GDP exceeding $28 trillion are powerful enough to support what could eventually evolve into a global reserve currency. In simple terms, the unit is engineered with a dual purpose. Roughly 40% focused on safety through time-tested gold, and 60% aimed at growth driven by the rising momentum of developing economies. The intention is balance, stable enough for nations to trust, yet dynamic enough to increase in value as these economies continue to expand. This isn't merely another payment option entering the market. It represents a structural challenge to the financial order that has shaped global money since the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. Which naturally leads to the next question. Why now? Why did these nations decide that January 2026 was the right moment to introduce an entirely new monetary framework? What changed? To understand the trigger, you have to go back to February 2022. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western nations led by the United States made a move that stunned financial observers around the world. More than $300 billion of Russia's foreign currency reserves were frozen, assets accumulated over decades and stored within Western financial institutions. Overnight, hundreds of billions became inaccessible, with nothing more than a coordinated policy decision. For other major economies watching closely, particularly those that occasionally find themselves at odds with Washington or Brussels, the message was impossible to ignore. It was a wake-up call, and for many, a deeply unsettling one. It revealed something few countries had fully confronted before. The modern global financial system, built largely on the dollar, the euro, and Western-controlled banking infrastructure, could be weaponized. If your national reserves sit inside a system governed by others, then ultimately, they hold the power to restrict your wealth. And if it could happen to Russia, a nuclear-armed G20 economy, then no nation was beyond reach. Saudi Arabia noticed, China noticed, India noticed, Indonesia and Turkey noticed. Behind closed doors, the realization was the same. We are exposed. Our national savings could, in theory, be locked away overnight if geopolitical tensions escalated or if we crossed an invisible red line. Almost instantly, the search for a financial Plan B shifted from quiet diplomatic conversations to an urgent matter of national security. The unit is that Plan B, now transformed from theory into reality. This initiative isn't necessarily about launching a financial war against the West. It is about building protection. Think of it as the construction of a financial shield, a parallel network designed so that trade flows, reserve assets, and economic independence cannot easily be frozen, sanctioned, or controlled by external powers whose strategic interests may differ. At its core, the lesson driving this shift is straightforward but powerful. If you don't control the financial system you operate within, that system can ultimately control you. At this point, you might be wondering whether this concept actually works outside of strategy papers and economic forums. Can countries truly conduct large-scale trade without leaning on the US dollar? The answer is no longer theoretical. It's already happening. Look at the relationship between Russia and China. As of January 2026, roughly 90% of bilateral trade between these two economic heavyweights, representing hundreds of billions of dollars in oil, natural gas, industrial equipment, electronics, and agricultural products, is being carried out without touching the US dollar. Zero. Transactions are settled directly in rubles and yuan, creating a real-world demonstration of what a post-dollar trading environment could look like. In many ways, this partnership has become the live testing ground, the large-scale proof of concept, for exactly what the unit is designed to achieve on a much broader global stage. Russia and China didn't wait for a flawless, fully designed system to be in place. Survival demanded immediate action in the face of Western sanctions, and they innovated solutions that worked around the dollar-centric global system. Think of it like this. The unit is the new superhighway that BRICS has officially opened. But for the past 4 years, Russia and China have been navigating the back roads and side streets, bypassing the dollar tolls and proving that this alternative route actually works. That 90% figure isn't a projection, it's not a goal, it's current reality, confirmed by trade data, and it marks the first undeniable structural crack in the dollar's absolute dominance over global trade. It demonstrates that large-scale, dollar-free commerce isn't just theoretically possible, it's already happening between two of the world's largest economies. Now consider the scale of this launch, because scale is what transforms an interesting experiment into a genuine challenge to the status quo. This isn't a coalition of small, fringe economies trying to make noise. The BRICS alliance, now expanded to include major players like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, represents nearly half of humanity, roughly 46% of the global population, over 3.6 billion people. Put that into perspective. The unit isn't being introduced into some distant, hypothetical market. It's entering a built-in user base of billions within some of the world's largest and fastest-growing economies. Immediate demand exists because these nations can start using the unit for trade right away. Oil from Russia to India, electronics from China to Brazil, agricultural products from Brazil to China, manufactured goods from India to Egypt. All of this can now flow through unit-based settlements. This combination of population scale, collective economic power exceeding $28 trillion in GDP, and control over vital resources, oil, gas, rare earths, agricultural commodities, gives this project enormous historical significance. It has the gravitational pull to influence global finance in a way that Western authorities simply cannot ignore. And this development directly affects something you may already own: gold. Since the unit is 40% backed by physical gold, the success and expansion of this system creates enormous structural demand for the metal. BRICS nations are already among the world's largest buyers and producers of gold. China, Russia, and India have been stockpiling gold for years, and the unit's operational launch only amplifies the importance and value of these reserves. If the unit achieves widespread adoption, with more countries joining and more trade flowing through the system, the demand for gold backing could grow exponentially. This is why major financial institutions, including JP Morgan, are forecasting gold prices to reach $5,000 per ounce by late 2026. Some analysts even predict $8,000 or higher if the unit becomes widely adopted. The logic is simple: supply and demand. BRICS central banks will need massive, continuous gold reserves to support an expanding currency system, while the global supply of physical gold remains relatively fixed. The unit isn't just a currency innovation. It could become a structural game changer for gold prices. Every transaction settled in units requires gold backing. More units in circulation directly means more demand for gold. And remember, this is a system designed to eventually handle trillions of dollars in trade annually. The implications for global commodities and precious metals are enormous. So what does all this mean for the United States? To understand that, we need to look at a concept most Americans have never heard of, yet benefit from every single day. Economists call it the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. Here's how it works. Because almost the entire world uses US dollars for international trade and holds dollars as reserves, the United States enjoys financial advantages that no other nation can match. America can borrow money more cheaply than any other country because there is always global demand for dollar-denominated assets. The US can run massive trade deficits year after year, importing far more than it exports, simply because other countries need dollars to function in the global economy. And critically, access to the dollar system allows the US to wield unparalleled geopolitical influence through sanctions, asset freezes, and financial exclusion. The BRICS unit is a direct, calculated challenge to this arrangement. But this isn't about the dollar collapsing next week or hyperinflation hitting tomorrow. That's not how this unfolds. Instead, the unit puts America's free ride on a timer. It doesn't explode overnight. It erodes gradually. For the first time in modern history, there's a credible, large-scale alternative system being built by major economies, offering countries a way to opt out of dollar dependency. The unit creates choice where once there was monopoly. Every time a country settles even a portion of its trade in units instead of dollars, global demand for the dollar, the foundation of American financial power, is incrementally reduced. If enough countries make that choice, even for just some transactions, it slowly but surely chips away at the dollar's exorbitant privilege. The US is not facing a sudden catastrophic collapse. Rather, it is witnessing the beginning of a gradual, persistent erosion of its most powerful economic advantage. And once that process gains momentum, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse, because the benefits of this alternative system are self-reinforcing. But perhaps the most significant strategic implication lies in how the unit affects third-party nations. Countries not yet in BRICS, but watching every move closely. Think of major developing economies: Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Vietnam. Many of these nations are struggling under massive debts denominated in US dollars. They are trapped in a familiar cycle. Their local currencies weaken, yet their dollar-denominated obligations remain steep and unforgiving. These countries are also frequently caught between competing geopolitical pressures from the US and China. For their leaders and central bankers, the BRICS unit is not about loyalty to Russia or China. It is about something far more practical: options, leverage, and risk management. It offers a way to trade with major partners while reducing exposure to dollar volatility and Western policy shocks. It could even serve as a potential escape route if they ever face sanctions or financial pressure. Every time one of these countries struggles with dollar-denominated debt, every time they feel the squeeze of dollar-based sanctions, every time they watch Federal Reserve policy decisions ripple chaos through their own markets, the appeal of the BRICS alternative grows stronger. This is how a monetary innovation transforms into a geopolitical realignment. The unit acts like a gravitational force, pulling nations toward greater independence and financial sovereignty. It won't replace the dollar for everyone overnight, but it begins to divide the world into distinct financial spheres of influence. The very fact that the unit exists, functioning and operational, signals to the next wave of countries that joining is now a realistic option. The system is built, it's tested, and it's ready for expansion. That optionality is the real threat to US dollar dominance. Of course, no discussion would be complete without addressing the elephant in the room, the biggest challenge to the long-term success of the unit. For this system to thrive over years and decades, BRICS nations need something incredibly difficult to achieve: sustained trust, coordination, and unified commitment. And therein lies their greatest vulnerability. Let's be candid. The BRICS alliance is a coalition of countries that have often been rivals, with conflicting strategic interests. China and India, the two largest members, are demographic giants with active border disputes and a history of deadly military clashes as recently as 2020. Their competition for regional influence in Asia is intense. Russia and China present a united front against the West, but historically, they've been rivals for influence in Central Asia and share a complicated relationship. Brazil's democratic government often has political priorities that differ sharply from Russia's authoritarian system. South Africa's economy is tiny compared to China and India, creating a natural asymmetry in influence and benefits. Managing a shared currency system under these conditions requires significant compromises. Countries must give up portions of their monetary sovereignty and policy control. And that, more than anything else, may determine whether the unit can not only survive its launch, but continue to grow and assert influence over the coming decades. That is an enormous ask for any proud, powerful nation. What happens during the inevitable economic crisis? If one member faces a severe recession or a currency collapse, do the others step in to bail them out? Who makes the monetary decisions? Who controls the gold reserves? And what if political relationships between members deteriorate? These are exactly the kinds of questions that have torn apart past monetary unions. Take the European common currency, the euro. It nearly collapsed during the Greek debt crisis, precisely because of coordination failures. And those were countries with far more shared history, culture, and political integration than BRICS ever has. So the greatest threat to the unit may not come from the US, Western sanctions, or external financial pressure. The threat could be internal fracture, disagreement, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining unity among diverse nations with competing interests over the long term. This is the vulnerability that Western analysts are counting on, the bet that BRICS will eventually crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. But there's a critical counterpoint. Shared opposition can be an incredibly powerful unifying force. BRICS nations may have differences, but they share one overwhelming interest: reducing dependency on a Western-dominated financial system that can be weaponized against them. That common motivation, rooted in real security concerns after watching Russia get financially isolated, may be strong enough to overcome internal divisions, at least for the foreseeable future. So what's the bottom line? How should we assess the launch of the BRICS unit in January 2026? This is not the story of the US dollar collapsing next month. That's the kind of sensational headline designed for clicks, but it isn't grounded in reality. The unit's launch is better understood as the starting gun for a slow-motion transformation of the global financial system. Its real victory isn't immediately replacing the dollar. Its success lies in existing and functioning as a credible operational alternative. For 80 years since Bretton Woods, there was effectively no choice in reserve currencies or international settlement. The dollar was it. Now, there is a choice, and that changes everything. What we are witnessing is the end of a total monopoly and the beginning of genuine competition in global reserve currencies. Practically, this means the dollar's dominance will face gradual, incremental pressure, not a sudden, catastrophic collapse. Countries now have negotiating leverage they never possessed before. When the US threatens sanctions, a nation can credibly respond. We'll just move more of our trade to the unit system. That is a game changer in geopolitical negotiations. The world isn't splitting neatly into two financial blocks overnight. Instead, it's evolving into a complex, multi-layered ecosystem where different countries use different systems for different purposes and partners. Some trade in dollars, some in units, some in euros. The BRICS unit has firmly planted its flag in this emerging multipolar landscape, and once planted, it will not be easy to remove. The rules that have governed global finance your entire life are being rewritten in real time. And whether you are an investor, a business owner, or someone simply trying to protect your savings, understanding this shift is no longer optional. It is essential. The world that emerges from this transformation will look very different from the one we've known. The era of unchallenged dollar supremacy is over. What comes next is anyone's guess. But ignoring it, that is no longer an option.